July 18, 1944. The skies over Memmingen, Germany, 20,000 feet above the earth. Lieutenant James Landon of the 332nd Fighter Group, the famed Tuskegee Airman, gripped the controls of his P-51 Mustang as the formation approached the target area. In his mind, this escort mission would proceed like the dozens before it, challenging but manageable. The irony was that within hours, everything he believed about aerial combat would be upended by necessity and inspiration. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one pilot's revolutionary tactical innovation not only saved a bombing mission from disaster, but transformed fighter escort doctrine for the remainder of the war. A change born not from military academies or planning rooms, but from the desperate ingenuity of a man whom many believed shouldn't have been in the cockpit at all. Lieutenant James Landon's day began at 4:30 hours at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy. The early summer air carried the scent of jet fuel and Mediterranean dust as he made his way to the briefing room. Landon was 24 years old, a college graduate from Howard University with a degree in mathematics and engineering. Before the war, he had been rejected from civilian flight schools in his home state of Pennsylvania, not for lack of aptitude, but because of the color of his skin. Now, as one of the elite Tuskegee Airmen, he flew one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. "Morning, Lieutenant," said Captain Marcus Williams, the operations officer for the 301st Fighter Squadron. Williams had been among the first to graduate from the experimental program at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. A veteran of 37 combat missions, Williams carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had repeatedly proven himself in an environment where the margin for error was non-existent. "Morning, sir," Landon replied, accepting the mug of coffee Williams offered. "What's the mission today?" "Big one. Escorting B-17s to the Messerschmitt factory at Memmingen. Intelligence reports heavy fighter presence in the area. They've been building up defenses there for weeks." Around them, the briefing room filled with other pilots from the 301st, part of the larger 332nd Fighter Group. Major Joseph Coleman entered, and the room fell silent. "Gentlemen," Major Coleman began, his voice carrying the weight of command, "today's mission is critical. The target is producing Bf-109s at a rate of 30 aircraft per day. Every plane that rolls off that line means more trouble for our bombers and for us. The factory complex includes engine assembly, airframe production, and a testing field. Intelligence estimates 120 enemy fighters in the area, including the new FW-190D models." A map appeared on the projection screen, showing the route from Italy, across the Alps, and into southern Germany. "We'll be flying escort for the 463rd Bombardment Group. 96 B-17s will be in the air. Their bomb load is primarily 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs, with some incendiaries mixed in. The bombers will be at 24,000 feet. We'll operate 2,000 feet above them in a standard escort formation." The briefing continued with weather reports, clear with scattered clouds at 15,000 feet, enemy anti-aircraft positions, heavy around the target, and emergency procedures. As the briefing ended, Major Coleman added one final note. "The 8th Air Force attempted to hit this target twice last month. Both missions were turned back with heavy losses. The enemy knows we're coming, gentlemen. They know what's at stake. But so do we." Questions? There were none. The pilots filed out to their aircraft, each man lost in his own pre-mission ritual. Some were silent, others chatted nervously. Lieutenant Walter Morris, Landon's wingman, hummed a jazz tune as he checked his equipment. "Ready for another day at the office, Jimmy?" Morris asked, slapping Landon on the shoulder. Morris was from Harlem, a former nightclub drummer before the war who approached aerial combat with the same improvisational flair. "Always," Landon replied, though his mind was elsewhere. Reviewing complex mental calculations of fuel consumption rates at different altitudes and speeds. His fellow pilots often teased him about his mathematical approach to flying, but Landon found that numbers never lied, unlike the many instructors and officers who had told men like him they couldn't fly combat aircraft. As they walked toward their aircraft, They passed Captain David Bronson of the 406th 3rd Bombardment Group. The bomber crews often visited the fighter base the evening before joint missions to coordinate communications and tactics. "Looking forward to seeing you boys up there tomorrow," Bronson said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Landon had encountered enough forced pleasantries in his life to recognize them instantly. "We'll be there, Captain," Landon replied evenly. "Your boys just focus on hitting the target. We'll handle the Luftwaffe." Bronson's smile tightened. "You know, some of my crew are worried about this whole experiment." He gestured vaguely at the airfield. "Experiment?" Lieutenant Morris interrupted, stepping forward. Major Coleman appeared behind them. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" Bronson straightened. "No, sir. Just discussing mission parameters." "Good," Coleman said, "because the only experiment tomorrow will be whether those Messerschmitts can fly without a factory to build them." His voice was pleasant, but his eyes held steel. "Captain Bronson, I believe your transport back to your base is waiting." As Bronson departed, Coleman turned to his pilots. "Focus on the mission, not the nonsense. We've completed 57 escort missions without losing a single bomber to enemy fighters. That's not an experiment. That's a record." The next morning, 26 P-51 Mustangs of the 332nd Fighter Group took off from Ramitelli Airfield at precisely 0705 hours. Their distinctive red-painted tails gleamed in the morning sunlight as they climbed to altitude, joined up in formation, and set course to rendezvous with the bombers coming from their bases in southern Italy. In the cockpit of his Mustang, which he'd named Catherine's Equation after his mother, Landon settled into the routine of long-range flight. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine hummed steadily, producing 490 horsepower that translated into a cruising speed of 362 miles per hour. The aircraft carried 269 gallons of fuel, including drop tanks, giving it a range of 650 miles. The cockpit was cramped but familiar, with the control stick between his legs and throttle to his left. The instrument panel displayed airspeed, altitude, heading, engine temperature, oil pressure, and fuel levels. At 0752, they made visual contact with the bomber formation, 96 B-17 Flying Fortresses arranged in combat boxes, their aluminum skins reflecting sunlight like schools of metallic fish swimming through an azure sea. Each bomber carried a crew of 10 men and a bomb load of 400 pounds. Together they represented more than 430 pounds of explosives headed for the Messerschmitt factory. "Woodpecker leader to big friends," Major Coleman radioed, using the designated call signs. "Red tails in position and ready to dance." "Roger that, Woodpecker leader," came the response from the bomber command. "Good to have you with us." Landon guided his aircraft into position above and to the right of the bomber formation. The mission profile called for the fighters to weave back and forth above the bombers, covering them from high-altitude attacks, while maintaining enough speed advantage to intercept any enemy fighters. For the next hour, the massive formation continued northeast, crossing the Alps. The jagged peaks passed below them, still snow-capped even in July. At their current altitude of 24,000 feet, the air temperature outside the aircraft was -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside his cockpit, despite the heater, Landon could feel the cold seeping in around his oxygen mask. At 0913, as they crossed into German airspace, the radio crackled with the first warning. "Bandits 12 o'clock high, approaching fast." Landon's eyes snapped to the position indicated. There, just visible against the blue sky, were the black specks of approaching enemy aircraft. "I count 20 plus," reported Captain Williams. "Looks like 109s, coming head-on." "All right, Red Tails." Major Coleman's voice was calm but commanding. "Blue section, stay with the bombers. Red and yellow sections, climb to engage. Remember, our priority is the bombers, not kill counts." "Roger that," Landon acknowledged, pushing his throttle forward and pulling back on the stick. Catherine's Equation responded immediately, the Merlin engine roaring as it climbed toward the approaching German fighters. The first engagement was brief but intense. The Messerschmitt pilots, realizing they were outnumbered, made a single pass at the bombers before diving away. Landon managed to get a good burst on one Bf-109, seeing his tracer rounds strike the fuselage, but the German pilot executed a tight roll and disappeared into a cloud bank below. "They're testing our response," Captain Williams commented over the radio. That was too easy. He was right. 20 minutes later, as they approached the German border with Austria, radar operators in the bomber formation picked up a much larger force assembling ahead. "Woodpecker leader, this is Big Friend Command. We're tracking 60-plus bandits at your 12 o'clock, range 30 miles. Major Coleman's response was immediate. "Acknowledged. All red tail units tighten formation. Blue section, move up to cover the front of the bomber stream. Yellow section, watch the flanks. Red section, prepare to engage head-on." The Luftwaffe's strategy became clear as they made visual contact. A large force of Focke-Wulf 190s and Bf 109s had positioned themselves directly in the bomber's path. Rather than engaging the fighters, they intended to break through and attack the bomber formation. "They're going to try to overwhelm us with numbers," Landon said to Morris on their private channel. "Standard doctrine isn't going to work here." "Got any bright ideas, Professor?" Morris replied, using Landon's nickname. "Not yet, but stay close." The next 20 minutes devolved into what pilots called a furball, a chaotic, swirling mass of aircraft engaged in dozens of individual dogfights. The sky filled with the roar of engines, the stutter of machine guns, and the occasional explosion as aircraft were hit. Landon found himself in a turning fight with two Bf 109s. The German pilots were skilled, working in tandem to try to force him into a vulnerable position. He used the P-51's superior high-altitude performance to climb away, then reversed into a diving attack, firing a burst that caused one of the 109s to trail smoke and disengage. But as he pulled out of his dive, Landon could see that the overall situation was deteriorating. Despite the valiant efforts of the Red Tails, some enemy fighters were breaking through to the bombers. The B-17's defensive guns were blazing, filling the air with additional streams of tracer fire. But 3 of the flying fortresses were already trailing smoke. One exploded suddenly, turning into a fireball that scattered debris across the sky. 10 men gone in an instant. "We're losing cohesion," Major Coleman's voice cut through the radio chatter. "All units regroup and reform on the bombers." Landon pulled his aircraft around, dispatching another FW-190 that crossed his path, and headed back toward the bomber formation. What he saw troubled him deeply. The 330 fighter screen had been drawn away from the bombers by the ferocity of the German attack. The Luftwaffe pilots had successfully employed a tactic of selective engagement, some fighting the escorts while others slipped through to attack the relatively defenseless bombers. As Landon watched, another B-17 took critical damage, its right wing shearing off completely. The massive aircraft entered a flat spin, with only 3 parachutes deploying before it disappeared into the cloud layer below. More lives lost, more American sons who would never return home. A cold calculation formed in Landon's mind. At the current rate of attrition, the bomber formation would lose at least 20% of its strength before reaching the target. The mission would likely be aborted, the Messerschmitt factory would remain operational, and these losses would be for nothing. Standard fighter escort doctrine, developed through years of air combat in this war, called for fighters to engage enemy aircraft at a distance from the bombers. The theory was sound: destroy the threat before it could threaten the bomber stream. But today, against these numbers and this level of coordination from the Luftwaffe, the doctrine was failing. Landon keyed his microphone. "Woodpecker leader, this is Red 3. Permission to try something unconventional." There was a brief pause before Major Coleman responded. "The current approach isn't working." "What do you have in mind, Red 3? "A mathematical solution, sir. Instead of spreading our defense perimeter wide, we contract it. Tight formation, directly adjacent to the bombers. No more than 100 yards separation." Captain Williams cut in. "That's contrary to everything in the manual, Lieutenant. We'll lose our speed advantage, our ability to climb and dive effectively." "Respectfully, sir, we've already lost 14 bombers, and we're still 40 minutes from the target," Landon replied. "The current geometry of engagement favors the enemy. They're using our own doctrine against us, drawing us away while their second wave hits the bombers." The radio was silent for a long moment. Landon could almost feel the mental calculations happening in Major Coleman's mind, weighing doctrine against reality, training against the evidence before their eyes. "Red 3, This is Woodpecker Leader. Implement your plan with Red Section. 4 aircraft. If it works, we'll expand it. If not, revert to standard formation." "Roger that," Landon acknowledged, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Red Section, on me. We're going to form a close perimeter around the lead bomber element." Lieutenant Morris fell in on Landon's wing, along with Lieutenants Jackson and Whitaker completing Red Section. Together, they dropped down to the altitude of the bombers and took position just 50 yards off the wingtips of the lead B-17 squadron. From the bombers' perspective, the sight of 4 Mustangs flying in such close proximity was unprecedented. Landon could see the gunners in their turrets, their expressions a mixture of confusion and hope. One gave a tentative thumbs up, which Landon returned. "What exactly is your plan here, Jimmy?" Morris asked over their private channel. "Proximity defense," Landon replied. "The Germans have to come to the bombers to attack them. When they do, they'll have to deal with us first, but we'll have the bombers' combined firepower supporting us." "That's assuming the bomber boys can shoot straight," Morris commented dryly. "A B-17 has 1350 caliber machine guns," Landon said. "That's a lot of lead in the air, even if their aim isn't perfect." The theory was put to the test just minutes later. A group of 6 FW-190s dove toward the bomber formation, expecting to break through the fighter screen as they had done previously. Instead, they found Landon's Red Section waiting directly in their path. "Here they come," Landon called. "Hold position until they commit, then break into them." The German pilots, seeing the fighters positioned so close to the bombers, hesitated momentarily, just long enough for Landon to get a perfect setup. "Break now!" The 4 P-51s simultaneously turned into the attacking Germans, their combined firepower catching the lead FW-190 and shredding its engine cowling. Simultaneously, the bomber gunners opened fire, adding their considerable firepower to the defense. The effect was devastating. 3 of the 6 German fighters were hit in the first exchange, with 1 exploding outright and 2 more breaking off trailing smoke. Keep it tight," Landon called as they reformed their close perimeter around the bombers. The remaining 3 FW-190s circled warily at a distance, clearly reassessing their approach. On the bomber command frequency, Landon could hear the squadron leaders discussing the sudden change in their fortunes. "Did you see that? They couldn't get through." Major Coleman was monitoring the situation. "Red 3, this appears to be working. Explain the concept for implementation across the group." Landon took a deep breath. "Sir, we position fighters in 2 layers. Inner layer flies tight formation with the bombers, almost as if they were part of the bomber boxes themselves. Outer layer flies 500 yards out, engages approaching enemy aircraft, but does not pursue beyond visual range of the bombers. It's a mathematical probability calculation. We create a defense where the enemy must pass through multiple layers, each with increasing firepower density." "Implementing group-wide," Coleman decided. "All sections, reconfigure according to Red 3's instructions. Inner layer, blue section. Outer layer, yellow and green sections. Red section maintains current position." The effect of the reorganization was immediate and dramatic. The next Luftwaffe attack wave approached with 30-plus fighters, expecting to find scattered resistance as before. Instead, they encountered a disciplined defense in depth that channeled them into killing zones where both fighter and bomber firepower could be concentrated. From the cockpit of Catherine's equation, Landon watched as the tide of battle shifted. A Bf-109 exploded less than 100 yards from his wingtip, the concussion rocking his Mustang. Another tried to dive through the formation and was caught in crossfire from 3 B-17s and Landon's own guns. The German aircraft seemed to disintegrate in mid-air, parts tumbling away in different directions. Captain Bronson's voice came over the radio from the lead bomber. "Whatever you red tails are doing, keep it up, this is working." As they continued toward the target, the Luftwaffe attacks became increasingly desperate and uncoordinated. The German pilots, trained to expect certain reactions from American fighters, found their tactics nullified by Landon's unconventional approach. The bomber stream, which had been losing aircraft at an alarming rate, now progressed with minimal additional losses. 10 minutes to target, came the call from Bomber Command. Prepare for heavy flak. The anti-aircraft fire over Memmingen was indeed intense. the sky filled with black puffs of smoke as German 88mm shells exploded around the formation. Unlike fighter attacks, there was no defense against flak except evasive maneuvering, which the heavily laden bombers could only perform in limited fashion. "Stay with them through the flak," Major Coleman ordered. "Do not break formation." It was one of the most difficult tests of airmanship Landon had ever faced. Flying in close proximity to the bombers while all aircraft jostled in the turbulence created by exploding shells required absolute concentration and control. One mistake could result in a mid-air collision that would be fatal to all involved. "Bombs away," called Captain Bronson as the B-17s released their payloads over the Messerschmitt factory. Through breaks in the clouds, Landon could see the explosions erupting across the target area. Production halls collapsed, test fields cratered, and storage facilities burst into flames. Good hits, the bomber crews reported excitedly. "Target severely damaged." The formation turned southwest, beginning the long journey home. Normally this would be the point where the danger diminished, as Luftwaffe fighters rarely pursued bomber formations all the way back to Allied territory. But today was different. The Germans, perhaps recognizing the significance of the target's destruction, mounted another coordinated attack as the bombers crossed back into Austria. "They're not giving up," Morris commented, as another wave of enemy fighters appeared on their flank. "Neither are we," Landon replied, maintaining his position. The new defensive formation proved its worth again as the German attacks were repulsed with minimal losses. By the time they reached the relative safety of Italian airspace, the bomber stream had suffered no additional losses beyond those incurred before Landon's tactical innovation. As they approached Ramitelli airfield at 16:22 hours, the extent of their accomplishment began to sink in. Of the 96 B-17s that had started the mission, 79 were returning, a loss rate of 7%. While still significant, it was far better than the 30–40% losses suffered on previous raids against heavily defended targets. On the ground, as the pilots gathered for debriefing, Major Coleman approached Landon. "That was quick thinking up there, Lieutenant. Unconventional but effective." "Thank you, sir," Landon replied. "It just seemed logical given the circumstances." "Logic born of desperation," Coleman nodded. "Sometimes that's where the best ideas come from." Captain Williams joined them, his expression thoughtful. "We've been fighting this air war for years now, developing doctrine, refining tactics, and then you come along and turn it all upside down in one mission." Landon tensed slightly, unsure if this was criticism. Williams broke into a rare smile. "And thank God you did. We're going to need to formalize this approach, write it up for other groups to implement." The impact of Landon's tactical innovation extended far beyond that single mission. Within 2 weeks, 8th Air Force Headquarters had distributed a tactical bulletin describing what was now called the Ramitelli Defense to all fighter groups in the European theater. By September 1944, it had become standard procedure for escort missions against heavily defended targets. But the true significance went deeper than military tactics. For the men of the 302nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen who had fought prejudice at home before facing the enemy abroad, it was validation of a different sort. 2 days after the Memmingen raid, Captain Bronson visited Ramitelli Airfield with several other bomber officers. They sought out Landon in the Officers' Club, where he sat with Morris and other pilots from Red Section. "Lieutenant Landon," Bronson said, extending his hand, "my crew and I came to thank you personally. Your tactical innovation saved a lot of lives up there." Landon shook the offered hand. "Just doing our job, Captain." "No," Bronson said, looking uncomfortable but determined. "It was more than that. I need to admit something. Before this mission, I had my doubts about whether your unit was up to the task." The room had gone quiet. Every Tuskegee Airman present had heard similar doubts throughout their careers. "I was wrong," Bronson continued, "dead wrong, and I'm man enough to say so. What you did up there wasn't just good flying, it was brilliant thinking under pressure, the kind of innovation that changes outcomes." He glanced around at the other pilots. "The men I fly with, we don't care what color the fighters are that protect us. We just care that they're there when we need them, and you men were there." It was a small moment in the vast panorama of the war, but for Landon and his fellow pilots, it represented something profound, recognition based solely on merit and achievement, the only true measure of a person's worth. In the months that followed, James Landon flew 37 more combat missions, was credited with destroying 4 enemy aircraft in the air and 7 more on the ground, and received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions during the Memmingen raid. The citation read, in part, "For extraordinary achievement while serving as a fighter pilot, Lieutenant Landon's tactical innovation under combat conditions resulted in significantly reduced bomber losses and contributed materially to the success of the mission." After the war, Landon returned to Pennsylvania, where he faced the cruel irony of being a decorated combat pilot who still couldn't get a job with a commercial airline because of his race. Instead, he used his GI Bill benefits to earn a master's degree in aeronautical engineering and eventually became one of the first African-American engineers hired by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the predecessor to NASA. The Ramitelli defense he developed under fire remained part of USAF tactical doctrine through the Korean War and influenced air combat theory into the jet age. More importantly, the achievements of the Tuskegee Airmen, including their unprecedented record of never losing a bomber to enemy fighters once Landon's tactics were implemented, became a powerful argument in the post-war debate over integrating the U.S. armed forces. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the military, a first step on the long road toward equality that would eventually lead to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. It's impossible to know how much the demonstrated excellence of the Tuskegee Airmen influenced this decision, but their record spoke volumes about the absurdity of segregation and the artificial limitations it imposed not just on individuals, but on society as a whole. In later years, when asked about his innovation during the Memmingen raid, Landon typically downplayed his role. "It wasn't genius," he would say, "it was just mathematics and observation. The standard tactics weren't working, so logically we needed something different. Anyone could have seen it. But not everyone did see it. It took a man with Landon's unique combination of technical education, combat experience, and perhaps most importantly, the perspective of someone who had spent his life finding ways around artificial barriers placed in his path." In 2007, at the age of 87, James Landon was among the Tuskegee Airmen who received the Congressional Gold Medal in recognition of their service. During the ceremony in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, he reflected on the long journey from Ramitelli Airfield to this moment of national honor. "We didn't fly and fight for recognition," he told a reporter. "We did it to prove that given equal opportunity, we could perform as well as anyone. The fact that we're standing here today receiving this medal in this building suggests that in some small way we succeeded. The true measure of that success extends beyond medals and citations. It lives in the changed perspectives of men like Captain Bronson, in the military doctrine that bears no name but implements a concept first demonstrated under fire by the Red Tails, and in the gradual, still incomplete evolution of American society toward the ideal expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal." On July 18, 1944, 24-year-old Lieutenant James Landon faced a critical moment, a mission failing, men dying, and conventional wisdom proving inadequate to the challenge. In that moment, he drew upon his education, his experience, and his inherent understanding that the established way is not always the best way. The tactical innovation he implemented not only saved lives and ensured mission success, but demonstrated once again that excellence knows no color. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen, including Landon's Ramitelli defense, is part of a larger narrative about America's growth as a nation, our struggles, our failures, our moments of insight, and our halting progress toward becoming a more perfect union. It reminds us that in our darkest hours, innovation often comes from unexpected sources, and that the greatest resource any nation has is the full measure of all its citizens' talents and contributions. Major Joseph Coleman retired from the Air Force in 1963 as a full colonel, having served with distinction in World War II Korea and the early years of American military involvement in Southeast Asia. When asked about the most significant contribution the 332nd Fighter Group made to military aviation, he would cite not their impressive combat record or their unique place in American history, but rather the lesson they taught about adaptation and innovation. The book says do it one way, he would explain, but the book was written based on certain assumptions. When those assumptions no longer hold, you write a new chapter. That's what Lieutenant Landon did over Memmingen. He saw that the established doctrine wasn't working under the specific conditions we faced, and he devised a mathematical solution that addressed the actual problem, not the theoretical one. This pragmatic approach to problem solving became characteristic of the 332nd throughout the remainder of the war. The unit continued to refine and adapt the Ramitelli defense based on combat experience and changing enemy tactics. By early 1945, they had developed variations for different scenarios, one configuration for escorting bomber streams, another for providing cover during the vulnerable bomb run phase, and a third for the return journey when fuel conservation became critical. The adaptability demonstrated by Landon and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen represented a distinctly American approach to warfare, practical, innovative, and unbound by rigid doctrine. It reflected the nation's industrial might and educational system, but also its cultural diversity, bringing different perspectives to bear on common challenges. Captain Marcus Williams, who had initially questioned Landon's unconventional approach, became one of its strongest advocates. After observing its effectiveness in combat, he worked with Landon to document the mathematical principles underlying the tactic, producing a formal report that was studied at fighter training schools throughout the Army Air Forces. The beauty of Landon's approach, Williams wrote, lies not just in its effectiveness, but in its elegant simplicity. By reconceptualizing the geometry of the engagement, he transformed what had been a disadvantageous situation into one that maximized our strengths while exploiting enemy weaknesses. This is the essence of tactical innovation. The report included detailed diagrams showing the optimal positioning of fighters relative to bomber formations, calculations of firepower concentration at various distances, and statistical analyses of combat results before and after implementation of the new tactics. It was a scientific approach to air combat that foreshadowed the operations research methodologies that would become standard in military planning during the post-war era. Lieutenant Walter Morris, Landon's wingman during the crucial Memmingen mission, approached the new tactics with his characteristic flair. While Landon conceived of the system in mathematical terms, Morris understood it intuitively as a jazz musician might grasp a complex arrangement, feeling the rhythm and flow of combat, the interplay between different elements of the formation. "Jimmy thinks in equations," Morris would joke, "but I think in music. To me, our fighters and the bombers are like different sections of a band. The bombers lay down the bass line, steady, powerful, moving forward. We're the brass and woodwinds, improvising around that foundation, responding to whatever the enemy throws at us, but always coming back to the main theme." This diversity of thought within the unit proved to be a strength, allowing them to refine the tactics from different perspectives. Landon provided the theoretical framework, Williams the doctrinal expertise, and Morris the intuitive adaptability that made the system work in the chaos of actual combat. The impact on bomber crews was equally significant. Captain David Bronson, who had initially harbored doubts about the Tuskegee Airmen, became their most vocal advocate among the bomber groups. After returning from the Memmingen mission, he submitted a formal commendation for the 332nd, specifically citing their innovative tactics and dedication to the bomber escort mission. Prior to this mission, he wrote, "Our group had experienced loss rates averaging 28% when attacking heavily defended targets in southern Germany. During the Memmingen raid, after implementation of the new escort tactics by the 332nd Fighter Group, our losses dropped to less than 18%, despite encountering heavier than expected enemy fighter resistance." The psychological effect on bomber crews cannot be overstated. The visible presence of our fighter escorts, their refusal to be drawn away from the formation, and their aggressive defense directly contributed to crew morale and mission effectiveness. The significance of this testimonial extended beyond military considerations. coming from a white officer who had previously expressed skepticism about the capabilities of black pilots. It represented the kind of transformation that occurred repeatedly as the Tuskegee Airmen demonstrated their skill and courage in combat. Such individual changes in perspective, multiplied across thousands of interactions, contributed incrementally to the larger social changes that would follow the war. For the men of the 322nd, validation came not just from official commendations, but from the more personal acknowledgments of their fellow airmen. After the Memmingen raid, bomber crews began specifically requesting escort from the Red Tail Angels, as they now called the Tuskegee Airmen. This nickname reflected both the distinctive marking on their aircraft and their dedicated protection of the bomber formations. Lieutenant Jackson, one of the pilots in Landon's Red Section during the crucial mission, described an encounter at an officers' club in Italy several weeks later. A B-17 pilot I'd never met before came over to our table, he recalled. He said his crew had been shot down twice before the Memmingen raid, and he'd been the only survivor the second time. He told us that when they saw our red tails forming up around them on this mission, he'd finally felt like they might make it home. Then he just shook each of our hands and walked away. No speeches, no big declarations, just that simple acknowledgement. Such moments carried special significance for men who had endured systematic discrimination throughout their lives. The Tuskegee Airmen had faced obstacles at every stage of their careers, from being told they lacked the intelligence and coordination to fly complex aircraft, to being segregated in their training and housing, to having their competence questioned even after they proved themselves in combat. Lieutenant James Landon's personal journey exemplified these challenges. Growing up in Pennsylvania during the Depression, he had shown an early aptitude for mathematics and science, earning top marks in his high school classes despite attending an underfunded segregated school with outdated textbooks and limited laboratory equipment. His mathematics teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Washington, recognized his potential and spent hours after school working with him on advanced concepts beyond the standard curriculum. "You have a gift," she told him. "Don't let anyone tell you there are limits to what you can achieve with it." When Landon applied to college in 1938, he faced the first major institutional barrier to his ambitions. Despite excellent grades and test scores, he was rejected by the engineering programs at several Pennsylvania universities. One admissions officer was unusually candid, telling him, "We don't believe Negroes have the aptitude for engineering disciplines. It would be setting you up for failure." Instead, Landon enrolled at Howard University, one of the nation's premier historically black colleges, where he thrived in the more supportive environment. His professors, many of whom had faced similar obstacles in their own careers, pushed him to excel while providing mentorship that extended beyond academics. Dr. William Claytor, a mathematician who had earned his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, despite facing severe discrimination, became a particular influence. "Mathematics doesn't care about the color of the person solving the equation," he told Landon. "It only cares whether the solution is correct." This perspective, that there are objective standards of excellence that transcend prejudice, became central to Landon's approach to both his education and his later military service. He graduated from Howard in 1942 with a degree in mathematics and engineering, just as the Army Air Corps was beginning its experiment with black aviators at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. The Tuskegee program itself had been established with mixed motives. Some military leaders genuinely wanted to expand opportunities for black Americans, while others designed it as a controlled experiment expected to prove that African Americans couldn't master complex aircraft. The training was rigorous, the standards higher than those applied to white cadets, and the scrutiny intense. Landon later described his time at Tuskegee as earning my wings twice over, first by mastering the actual skills of aviation, and second by overcoming the psychological burden of knowing that any failure would be attributed not just to him as an individual, but to his entire race. "Every time we went up, we were flying for more than ourselves," he explained. "We were flying to disprove 100 years of stereotypes and pseudoscience about black intellectual capabilities. That's a heavy load to carry into combat." Yet it was precisely this experience, of having to excel despite artificial barriers that prepared men like Landon to think beyond conventional approaches when faced with challenges in combat. Having spent their lives finding alternate routes around obstacles placed in their path, they were perhaps better equipped than most to recognize when established doctrine needed to be reconceived. The Ramitelli defense that Landon developed over Memmingen wasn't just a tactical innovation, it was an extension of the adaptive thinking that had been necessary for his survival and success in pre-war America. When conventional approaches failed, he instinctively looked for alternatives rather than continuing to apply methods that weren't working. This capacity for adaptive thinking proved valuable throughout the European campaign. As the war progressed and German air defenses evolved, the 382nd continued to modify their escort tactics. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe, facing critical fuel shortages and depleted pilot ranks, had shifted to a strategy of concentrated, high-speed attacks against bomber formations. Rather than engaging in extended dogfights, German fighters would make a single pass at high speed, then dive away to safety. Lieutenant Whittaker, the fourth pilot in Red Section during the Memmingen raid, noticed this pattern during a mission in February 1945. Working with Landon, he developed a counter-tactic that involved positioning a section of P-51s above the main defensive screen, flying at higher than normal altitude. When German fighters made their diving attacks, this high-cover section would have the energy advantage to pursue and engage them during their escape attempt. This evolution of the original concept demonstrated the ongoing process of tactical refinement that characterized the 322nd's approach to combat operations. Rather than rigidly adhering to a single method, they continually adapted based on battlefield observations and changing enemy behavior. By the final months of the war, the 322nd Fighter Group had established a reputation not just for courage and skill, qualities demonstrated by many fighter units on both sides, but for tactical innovation and disciplined execution. Their unique contribution to the air campaign in Europe was recognized in an 8th Air Force assessment conducted in April 1945. The 322nd Fighter Group has developed and implemented escort tactics that have significantly reduced bomber losses while maintaining an impressive record of enemy aircraft destroyed. Their methods, particularly the close integration of fighter defense with bomber formations, represent a valuable addition to our tactical doctrine and have been adopted throughout the command with positive results. For the individual pilots of the 322nd, each mission remained a dual challenge, fighting both the enemy in the air and the prejudice that followed them even into combat. Yet with each successful sortie, each bomber protected, each enemy aircraft destroyed, they built a record that spoke for itself. Lieutenant James Landon completed his tour of duty in April 1945, having flown 72 combat missions and achieved the rank of captain. His personnel file contained commendations from bomber groups, tactical assessments that had influenced Air Force doctrine, and the Distinguished Flying Cross awarded for his actions over Memmingen. By any objective measure, he had proven himself an exceptional officer and pilot. Yet when he returned to the United States in May 1945, he stepped back into a society still deeply divided by race. Despite his combat record and technical expertise, commercial airlines rejected his applications. Engineering firms showed interest in his resume until he appeared for interviews, at which point positions mysteriously became already filled. The contrast between his experience in the military, where his innovation had been recognized and implemented, and civilian life was stark. In the high-stakes environment of aerial combat, results mattered more than race. But in peacetime America, even with a war hero's record, he found doors still closed based solely on the color of his skin. This paradox, being deemed worthy to risk his life for his country, but not to work alongside white Americans in civilian jobs, was a common experience for returning black veterans. The disconnect between America's stated ideals and its social practices became increasingly difficult to justify in the post-war period, fueling the nascent civil rights movement that would gain momentum in the following decades. For Landon personally, the path forward came through education. Using the GI Bill, he pursued a master's degree in aeronautical engineering at the University of Michigan, one of the few top programs that accepted black students at that time. Even there, he faced social isolation and was excluded from study groups and professional networking opportunities that were critical for career advancement. I went from being evaluated based on my ideas and performance to being judged solely on appearances, he later wrote. It was like stepping backward in time. Yet he persevered, completing his degree in 1948 and eventually securing a position with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, at Langley Research Center in Virginia. As one of the first black engineers hired by the agency, he faced resistance from some colleagues and was initially assigned to computational tasks below his qualifications. Over time, however, his technical abilities again overcame prejudice. By the mid-1950s, he was leading a team working on high-speed aerodynamics research that contributed to both military and civilian aircraft development. When NACA transitioned to NASA in 1958, Landon continued his career with the space agency, eventually contributing to the Mercury and Gemini programs. Throughout these years, he maintained contact with several of his fellow Tuskegee Airmen. Lieutenant Walter Morris pursued a career in music education, teaching in public schools in New York while playing jazz professionally on weekends. Captain Marcus Williams remained in the Air Force, retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1965. Major Joseph Coleman, as previously mentioned, achieved the rank of colonel before his retirement. Their paths diverged, but they shared the common experience of having been part of something historic. Not just the first black combat aviation unit in American history, but a group whose performance had helped change perceptions about race and ability. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, including Landon's tactical innovation, extended beyond military history. Their achievements became a powerful argument against segregation. If black Americans could excel in the demanding environment of aerial combat, defending their country despite facing discrimination within it, how could their continued second-class status be justified? This question gained urgency in the post-war years, as returning veterans of all races who had fought for democracy abroad questioned its incomplete implementation at home. President Harry Truman, influenced by both moral considerations and practical concerns about America's image in the developing Cold War, issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. While this was an important step, full integration took years to implement, and civilian society changed even more slowly. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s built upon the foundation laid by black service members whose demonstrated excellence undermined the false premises of segregation. James Landon lived to see many of these changes. After retiring from NASA in 1983, he became active in efforts to document and preserve the history of the Tuskegee Airmen. He gave talks at schools, universities, and military academies, sharing not just war stories, but the larger lessons about innovation, adaptation, and the importance of removing artificial barriers to human potential. When asked about the significance of the Ramitelli defense he had developed under fire, he typically emphasized the collaborative nature of the achievement. It wasn't just my idea, he would insist. It was a team effort. Morris flying on my wing, Major Coleman trusting us to try something unorthodox, Captain Williams formalizing it into something that could be taught to others. And most importantly, it worked because the bomber crews and fighter pilots trusted each other. That's the real lesson. When people from different backgrounds work together toward a common goal, focusing on results rather than preconceptions, remarkable things can happen. This perspective reflected Landon's lifelong belief that excellence is the most powerful argument against prejudice. Rather than focusing on grievances, he emphasized achievement, not just his own, but the collective accomplishments of the 332nd Fighter Group and the individual contributions of its members. As the years passed and American society evolved, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen gained wider recognition. Books were written, documentaries produced, and eventually a feature film released bringing their achievements to new generations. The narrative resonated beyond the specific historical context, offering universal lessons about courage, perseverance, and the human capacity for innovation under pressure. In 2007, when President George W. Bush presented the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen, including James Landon, then 87 years old, The ceremony represented more than recognition of wartime service. It acknowledged a debt owed not just for their combat actions, but for their role in transforming American society through their example. For all the unreturned salutes and unforgivable indignities, President Bush said during the ceremony, "I salute you for your service to the United States of America." For Landon, standing among his fellow surviving airmen, some in wheelchairs, others using canes, all now elderly men, it was a moment of reflection on a journey that had begun more than 6 decades earlier. From the segregated classroom where Mrs. Washington had first encouraged his mathematical gifts, to the skies over Memmingen, where those same abilities had saved lives and influenced military doctrine, to this moment of national recognition. His life paralleled America's own halting progress toward its founding ideals. After the ceremony, a reporter asked him what message he hoped younger generations would take from the Tuskegee Airman's story. "2 things," he replied after a moment's thought. "First, never accept artificial limitations on your potential. If someone tells you something can't be done, especially because of who you are rather than what you're trying to do, that's usually more about their limitations than yours. And second, when the established way isn't working, don't be afraid to try something different. Innovation often comes from those who see the world from a different angle." These principles, rejecting artificial limitations and embracing innovation, had guided not just his actions over Memmingen on that July day in 1944, but his entire life's journey. They represented lessons hard-won through personal experience, yet universally applicable. As he aged, Landon became increasingly reflective about the broader significance of his wartime service. In one of his last interviews, conducted in 2011 when he was 91, he observed, "War is a terrible thing, but it sometimes accelerates social change that might otherwise take generations. The crisis of World War II created an opportunity for us to demonstrate what we could do if given the chance. The question is whether we as a society can learn to recognize and develop human potential without needing a crisis to force our hand." It was a profound question that extended beyond issues of race to encompass all the ways in which societies sometimes waste the talents of their citizens through prejudice, rigid thinking, or failure of imagination. James Landon passed away in 2012 at the age of 92, one of the last surviving pilots from the original Tuskegee Airmen. At his funeral, former comrades and family members were joined by active-duty Air Force personnel, including several black officers whose careers had been made possible, in part by the barriers he and his fellow airmen had helped break down. The eulogy was delivered by a young female African-American pilot, Captain Shauna Williams, who had flown combat missions in Afghanistan. "Captain Landon never knew me," she said, "but I knew him, not personally, but through the legacy he helped create. Every time I climb into the cockpit, I carry with me the knowledge that he and his generation proved, under the most demanding circumstances imaginable, that what matters is not what you look like, but what you can do. That's a gift beyond measure." After the service, attendees shared memories of Landon, his quiet determination, his mathematical mind, his dry sense of humor. Walter Morris, one of the few surviving members of the original Red Section, recalled a moment from their training days at Tuskegee. "We were in ground school studying aerodynamics," Morris remembered. "The instructor was describing how an aircraft behaves in a spin, and Jimmy raised his hand and pointed out an error in one of the equations on the blackboard. The instructor, a white officer who wasn't particularly happy about being assigned to Tuskegee, got flustered and said something like, 'I suppose you think you know more about this than I do.' And Jimmy, in that calm way of his, just said, 'No, sir. I just know that particular equation isn't balanced. Mathematics doesn't care who solves it, only whether the solution is correct.'" It was a story that captured the essence of James Landon, his technical precision, his quiet confidence, and his lifelong conviction that excellence is the ultimate answer to prejudice. These qualities had served him well during that critical moment over Memmingen, when conventional wisdom failed and innovation was needed. Today, the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, including Landon's tactical contribution, lives on in multiple dimensions. Militarily, the Ramitelli defense he developed influenced fighter escort doctrine through several conflicts and contributed to the American approach of flexible, adaptive tactics rather than rigid adherence to pre-war doctrine. Socially, the example set by the 332nd Fighter Group helped change perceptions about race and ability, contributing incrementally but significantly to the larger civil rights movement that transformed American society in the post-war decades. While full equality remains a work in progress, the distance traveled since the days when men like Landon were told they lacked the aptitude to fly or engineer complex systems is considerable. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Lieutenant James Landon's innovation over Memmingen offers a timeless lesson about the value of diverse perspectives in problem-solving. Had all American fighter pilots come from identical backgrounds, with identical training and identical worldviews, they might have continued applying the same tactics even when those tactics were failing. It was Landon's different perspective, shaped in part by his experience of having to find alternative paths around artificial barriers, that enabled him to reconceptualize the problem and develop a solution. This lesson extends beyond military applications to all fields of human endeavor. Innovation often emerges not from the center, but from the margins, from those who see the world slightly differently because of their unique experiences and perspectives. By excluding or discounting certain groups, societies don't just harm those individuals, they deprive themselves of potential solutions to their most pressing problems. The skies over Memmingen on July 18, 1944, where a mathematical approach born of necessity saved lives and changed doctrine, offer a compelling illustration of this principle. It's a reminder that excellence knows no color, that innovation can come from unexpected sources, and that societies are strongest when they recognize and develop the full potential of all their citizens. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.